Imagine walking through a medieval city where wearing the wrong shade of blue could cost you your freedom, your fortune, or your soul. Imagine a world where the color of your cloak was not a choice of style, but a strictly enforced decree issued by emperors and popes. In the 14th century, color was power. It was status, divine authority, and extreme wealth. But most of all, color was dangerous. Under strict sumptuary laws and severe church doctrines, displaying vibrant hues was heavily restricted, heavily taxed, and in many cases completely forbidden to ordinary human beings. Royal purple was reserved exclusively for monarchs. Ultramarine blue was legally restricted because it was considered too holy and too expensive for mortal eyes. Bright scarlet red was policed so fiercely that wearing it without a noble pedigree could result in immediate asset seizure. Yet, right under the noses of kings and cardinals, a secretive cartel of pigment merchants did not just survive these draconian bans. They weaponized them. They turned the literal restriction of light and color into one of the most lucrative, cutthroat, and terrifying financial monopolies in human history. They built a multi-billion-dollar trade network stretching from the treacherous mountain mines of Badakhshan to the trading houses of Venice, Florence, and Nuremberg. How did a small group of guild traders bypass total trade bans, outsmart papal inquisitors, and force the richest empires on earth to pay exorbitant prices for dirt, crushed bugs, and rotten plants? To understand how they pulled off this impossible heist, you have to throw away everything you think you know about medieval commerce. You were never buying paint. You were buying permission to control visual reality. Picture yourself standing in the grand market square of Florence in the year 1350. You are an ambitious merchant looking to dress your family in fine clothing to signal your growing success. But as you reach for a bolt of deep azure cloth, a city official grabs your shoulder. He points to a framed parchment hanging on the municipal stone wall. It is the Sumptuary Code of the Republic. It explicitly states that commoners who wear blue dyed with imported lapis lazuli will be fined 50 gold florins, stripped of their garments in public, and banished from the city limits. You look around and notice that almost everyone is wearing dull, muddy shades of gray, undyed wool, or murky brown. The visual realm of the Middle Ages was deliberately engineered to be monochrome for the masses and brilliant for the elite. The church taught that vanity was a deadly sin, and bright colors were the ultimate expression of earthly pride. But there was a far more practical, ruthless reason behind these restrictions. Color was scarce, absurdly expensive, and extraordinarily difficult to manufacture. Consider ultramarine, the most coveted pigment of the ancient and medieval worlds. Ultramarine did not come from European soil. It came from a single terrifyingly remote source, the lapis lazuli mines of Badakhshan, located deep within the high-altitude mountains of modern-day Afghanistan. To get a single kilogram of this blue stone to Europe, it had to be mined by hand in icy subterranean caverns, carried across the Pamir Mountains on pack mules, transported across desert trade routes controlled by hostile warlords, loaded onto galleys across the Mediterranean, and processed through secret chemical washing techniques in Venice. By the time a single ounce of ultramarine reached a painter or a textile master in Western Europe, it cost more than its weight in pure gold. The church declared that ultramarine was so precious that it could only be used to paint the robes of the Virgin Mary. Any secular use was seen as outright sacrilege. Now ask yourself the central question that built an empire. If the church forbade the secular use of elite colors, and if local governments outlawed commoners from wearing them, how on earth did pigment merchants turn crushed blue stone into a multi-billion-dollar commercial cartel? The answer lies in the illusion of the restriction itself. You see, the merchants quickly realized that when a government forbids a commodity, it does not destroy demand, it multiplies it. The restriction creates an artificial scarcity so intense that whoever controls the legal and illegal channels of supply gains absolute pricing power. You think these merchants made their fortunes simply by selling small pots of paint to famous artists like Giotto or Jan van Eyck? Cross that out immediately. That was just the public storefront, the tiny tip of a massive economic iceberg. The real money was not made in fine art. It was made in the massive industrial textile trade, international financial arbitrage, and the systematic exploitation of legal loopholes hidden inside medieval trade law. Let us break down the first hidden mechanism of their financial machine: the chemical alchemy exemption. Medieval law was obsessed with classification. Church law strictly forbade the import of luxury dyes that competed with local agricultural products. For instance, local European farmers grew a plant called woad, which produced a low-grade, dull blue dye. Woad farming was heavily protected by local feudal lords who collected tax on every harvest. Importing foreign dyes or higher-grade pigments was treated as economic treason. So how did the pigment merchants bypass this? They relied on a crucial legal distinction between raw materials and transformed substances. A pigment merchant would not import blue dye directly. Instead, they imported raw, unrefined minerals, toxic metallic salts, and raw botanical resins under the guise of medicinal apothecary supplies. Under medieval trade codes, apothecaries and alchemists operated under special academic exemptions because their materials were classified as potential medicines or scholarly materials. The merchants established complex networks of apothecaries across Europe. When a shipment of raw Afghan lapis lazuli or Asian indigo arrived at the port of Genoa, the cargo manifest did not list them as dyes or pigments. They were listed as lapis medicinalis, an ancient stone believed to cure melancholia and blood ailments. Once the shipment cleared customs tax-free, it was moved to secretive backyard laboratories where guild artisans transformed the raw minerals into high-potency pigment powders and concentrated dye cakes. They had effectively smuggled high-value industrial dyes directly through customs using medical loopholes. Here is where the story takes a turn that frightened even the regional rulers. Once the pigments were processed inside guild city walls, the merchants encountered their next obstacle: the sumptuary police. City inspectors routinely raided textile shops and private homes, seizing illegal colorful garments and fining anyone wearing forbidden shades. To protect their wealthy customers and maintain a booming market, the pigment cartels created the second mechanism of their monopoly: the guild color licensing scheme. Instead of fighting the sumptuary laws, the pigment cartels partnered with the very municipal governments that wrote the laws. The merchants approached city councils with a devious proposal. They offered to pay a massive annual lump sum tax directly into the municipal treasury in exchange for an exclusive color charter. Under this charter, the city council granted the pigment guild the right to issue official tax stamps for dyed fabrics. If a wealthy merchant or minor noble wanted to wear a deep crimson cloak or an azure tunic without being arrested, they simply had to buy a color license from the guild. The guild stamped the inside lining of the cloth with a special lead seal, proving that the wearer had paid the sumptuary exemption fee. The city got a steady stream of revenue without having to collect individual fines. The elite got to flaunt their wealth legally, and the pigment merchants secured an absolute monopoly over who was allowed to buy and wear color. If you did not have the official guild lead stamp, your clothes were confiscated and burned in the public square. If you bought pigment from an unlicensed merchant, you were branded an illicit counterfeiter and cast into dungeon vaults. The pigment merchants had successfully turned state prohibition into a state-enforced protection racket. Wait, it gets even more calculated. Let us examine the third and most lucrative mechanism of their financial empire: the Woad cartel of Toulouse and Thuringia, and the invention of synthetic market manipulation. Long before blue synthetic dyes existed, European textile centers relied heavily on Isatis tinctoria, commonly known as woad. Woad was a leafy yellow-flowered plant that required back-breaking labor to harvest, ferment, and process into a pungent blue dye paste. The regions around Toulouse in southwestern France and Thuringia in Germany became the global epicenters of woad production. The wealthy merchants who controlled this trade were known as the blue gold barons. These woad barons operated with a level of financial sophistication that rivaled modern hedge funds. They realized that the price of blue dye depended entirely on weather conditions, harvest yields, and shipping delays. So, they created a complex system of forward contracts and debt futures. A woad baron would travel through peasant villages long before the harvest season began. They would offer poor tenant farmers upfront cash loans to cover their living expenses and equipment costs. In exchange, the farmer signed a binding contract agreeing to sell their entire future woad harvest exclusively to the baron at a fixed, dirt-cheap price locked in months in advance. If the harvest was abundant, the baron bought the woad at the rock-bottom contract price and stored the processed dye balls in massive dry guild warehouses. They deliberately withheld supply from the market, creating an artificial shortage that drove open market dye prices through the roof. If the harvest failed due to drought or frost, the farmers were plunged into unpayable debt. The barons then seized the farmers' land, converting independent agricultural workers into bonded laborers who worked the woad processing vats for pennies. By controlling both the supply of the raw plant and the warehousing infrastructure, the blue-gold barons of Toulouse turned their city into one of the wealthiest financial capitals of Renaissance Europe. The immense mansions of Toulouse, built with soaring brick towers known as hotelleries, were constructed entirely on the profits of fermented leaves that made cloth blue. Wealthy woad merchant Pierre d'Assezat became so immensely rich that he personally underwrote loans for kings and helped finance international military campaigns, all off the back of a monopoly on blue dye balls. But the woad barons were not the only ones building fortunes out of forbidden hues. Down in Italy, an even more sinister and exclusive pigment monopoly was operating in the shadows of the Vatican, the papal red monopoly. For centuries, the most prestigious red dye in human history was Tyrian purple, extracted from the sea snails of the Mediterranean. But after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the trade routes to these snail beds were cut off, leaving European royalty and high-ranking church cardinals without their signature status symbol. The church needed a new, majestic color that represented spiritual power and sacrifice. Enter Cochineal's European predecessor, kermes. Kermes was an extraordinary, hyper-expensive pigment made from the dried, crushed bodies of tiny scale insects that lived on oak trees in the Mediterranean region. It took over 80,000 dried insects to produce just 1 single pound of kermes dye powder. Because collecting these microscopic insects was painstaking and labor-intensive, kermes red was astronomically expensive. The papacy realized that controlling the production and distribution of kermes was equivalent to holding the keys to the kingdom of visual prestige. In 1464, Pope Paul II issued an official decree ordering that all cardinal robes must henceforth be dyed in brilliant kermes red, replacing the older purple robes. Overnight, the demand for kermes exploded across every ecclesiastical court in Europe. But the Vatican did not leave this trade to random merchants. They established an exclusive trade alliance with the powerful merchant bankers of Florence, including the legendary Medici family. Here is how the papal red monopoly operated. The Medici Bank financed the collection and import of raw kermes from southern Europe and the Levant. In exchange for providing liquid capital, the Pope granted the Medici-backed cartel a holy monopoly over the distribution of cardinal red dye. No dyer in Europe was permitted to process or sell true ecclesiastical red without a papal license. If a rogue dyer was caught using unauthorized red dye, they were not just fined by local authorities. They were excommunicated by the church, effectively cutting them off from all legal trade, social protection, and religious sacraments. Imagine running a business where competing with you was literally classified as a sin worthy of eternal damnation. The Medici-backed pigment cartel could charge whatever price they wanted. A single bolt of kermes-dyed silk could cost as much as an entire country manor house complete with livestock and farmhands. Kings and dukes went into catastrophic debt simply to buy enough kermes-dyed velvet to dress their royal courts for coronations. You might think that between the woad barons of France and the kermes cartels of Italy, the medieval pigment market had reached its absolute peak, but the true golden age of the pigment monopoly was triggered by a discovery so massive, so lucrative, and so dangerous that it sparked international naval wars and changed global trade forever. To understand how the entire system escalated, we must look at the dark, toxic secret behind another widely banned color, lead white and orpiment yellow. While rich blue and deep red were regulated through luxury laws and church decrees, basic functional pigments like bright white and brilliant yellow were regulated because they were lethally toxic. Lead white was manufactured by suspending heavy sheets of metallic lead over tubs of steaming vinegar inside enclosed rooms packed with rotting animal manure. The chemical reaction between the acetic acid, carbon dioxide from the manure, and metallic lead created a pure, brilliant white powder known as basic lead carbonate. The production process was a nightmare of public health. Workers in these lead factories suffered from severe lead poisoning, nervous system failure, blindness, and excruciating paralysis. Because of the horrific stench and obvious lethality of the factories, medieval city ordinances strictly banned lead white manufacturing anywhere near populated areas. Did this stop the pigment merchants? Absolutely not. They simply moved their chemical operations to isolated rural enclaves, established shell companies under local monastic management, and created a black market supply line into urban centers. Because pure white was essential for mixing every shade of paint and preparing gesso canvas grounds, the demand for lead white was absolute and continuous. The merchants controlled the output, absorbed the human cost without liability, and sold lead white at markups exceeding 800%. The same was true for orpiment, a brilliant golden yellow pigment composed of arsenic trisulfide. Orpiment was so toxic that inhaling its dust while grinding it could cause immediate respiratory damage and slow death. Yet, because it mimicked the glint of real gold leaf at a fraction of the price, painters and manuscript illuminators craved it. Pigment merchants held tightly guarded secrets on how to stabilize and grind orpiment safely, charging premium fees for processed powders that they alone knew how to handle without dying on the job. By the late 15th century, the European pigment cartels had achieved near-total dominance over visual culture. They controlled the raw mineral mines in Asia, the agricultural woad fields of France and Germany, the insect harvest networks of the Mediterranean, and the toxic chemical processing plants hidden in the countryside. They had secured legal monopolies through municipal charters and religious protection through papal decrees. Their power seemed completely unshakable. But like all grand monopolies built on artificial scarcity and draconian laws, the pigment empire contained a fatal vulnerability. They were entirely unprepared for the moment the map of the world was ripped apart and rewritten overnight. The year is 1519. Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés march into the heart of the Aztec Empire in central Mexico. Amidst the jaw-dropping architecture of Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards notice something in the bustling outdoor markets that sends shockwaves through their economic instincts. They see market stalls piled high with bags of an intensely brilliant, blood-red powder. It is a shade of scarlet so deep, so luminous, and so infinitely superior to European kermes that it makes local European red dyes look like dull mud. The powder was cochineal, derived from a tiny parasite insect that lived on the prickly pear cactus, cultivated by indigenous Mesoamerican farmers for centuries. When Spanish merchants realized that cochineal contained 10 times more concentrated dye per insect than European kermes, they realized they were sitting on the greatest financial gold mine since the discovery of American silver mines. The Spanish crown immediately declared cochineal a royal state secret. They instituted total maritime protectionism. Exporting living cochineal insects or cactus plants out of Spanish-controlled territories was made punishable by immediate death. Every single pound of cochineal harvested in Mexico had to be shipped on heavily armed Spanish treasure galleons straight to the port of Seville. When Spanish cochineal hit European markets in the mid-16th century, it unleashed absolute economic chaos. The old European kermes cartels and local dye guilds panicked. The Medici-backed networks that had dominated ecclesiastical red for a century saw their market share collapse overnight. Cochineal was brighter, more durable, and cheaper to produce than kermes. Spanish merchants began pulling in fortunes that rivaled the silver shipments from Potosi. Cochineal became Spain's second most valuable export from the New World. The French Woad barons and Italian pigment lords tried everything to stop the Spanish invasion. They launched aggressive propaganda campaigns. European guild leaders lobbied city councils and monarchs to ban cochineal, claiming that the Mexican dye was toxic, demonic, and an unholy substance that rotted cloth. In several German states, municipal governments passed laws banning cochineal under penalty of heavy fines, calling it the devil's dye. Cross out any idea that these legal bans were about protecting public safety or spiritual purity. They were desperate, protectionist death throes from a dying European cartel that was being completely outcompeted by globalized trade routes. While the red pigment market was being torn apart by Spanish cochineal, an even bigger disaster was brewing for the blue gold barons of Toulouse and Thuringia. For centuries, European woad merchants had relied on local laws to keep foreign indigo out of Europe. True indigo, derived from the Indigofera tinctoria plant grown in India and South Asia, was far superior to European woad. A single kilogram of Asian indigo paste contained as much dye content as 30 kilograms of European woad paste. It produced a richer, deeper blue with a fraction of the processing time and stench. As Portuguese, Dutch, and English trade ships established direct ocean routes to India, bypassing the old Silk Road land routes, massive shipments of Asian indigo began flooding into European ports. The Dutch East India Company in particular realized that selling Indian indigo in Europe could undermine the economic foundation of the French and German states. What followed was one of the most vicious trade wars in early modern history, the Woad Wars. The woad barons of Toulouse and Nuremberg fought back with maximum political force. They convinced King Henry IV of France and the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire to issue absolute prohibitions against Indian indigo. In Nuremberg, the city council forced all local dyers to take a solemn annual oath promising on their salvation that they would never, under any circumstances, use a single grain of imported indigo. In France, the king issued an edict stating that anyone caught using imported indigo would be executed by hanging. For nearly a century, Europe became a battleground of illicit dye smuggling. Merchant ships sailed into northern European ports under false flags, carrying barrels of Indian indigo labeled as dark rice, medicinal herbs, or slate dust. Textile dyers operated illegal underground vats in dark basements, mixing small amounts of smuggled Indian indigo into their traditional woad mixtures to produce vibrant blues that outshone their competitors' products. The woad cartels set up networks of dyer inspectors who broke into workshops in the middle of the night, dipping chemical testing strips into vat liquids to detect the presence of banned Indian indigo. If a vat tested positive, the workshop was destroyed, the dyer was imprisoned, and their family was cast out onto the streets. But you cannot stop basic economic gravity with execution threats and guild inspections forever. The cost difference was simply too vast. A dyer using Indian indigo could produce better cloth at 1/5 the cost of a dyer using European woad. By the mid-17th century, the protectionist dam broke completely. The financial collapse of the woad regions was swift and catastrophic. Cities like Toulouse, which had grown insanely rich on woad wealth, saw their economic foundations crumble in a matter of decades. Massive woad mansions were abandoned or sold off for pennies on the gold florin. The great woad processing warehouses of Thuringia rotted away as European dyer guilds finally abandoned woad in favor of imported indigo. The once mighty blue gold barons, who had controlled European blue dye for 300 years, were wiped out. The fall of the woad monopoly marked the end of the medieval pigment era and the birth of modern global commercial enterprise. The secretive guilds, the religious restrictions, and the sumptuary laws that had governed human appearance for centuries could not survive the onslaught of global supply chains and competitive capitalism. So what is the true legacy of this incredible historical saga? What did these medieval pigment merchants actually build that survives in our modern world today? Look closely at how modern luxury brands, pharmaceutical giants, and corporate monopolies operate today. The structural playbook was written by medieval pigment merchants 600 years ago. They were the first to demonstrate that the most valuable asset in business is not the physical product itself, but the artificial control over its availability. They proved that if you can use legal frameworks, government licensing, and religious or moral fear to restrict access to a desirable substance, you can generate profit margins that defy normal economic laws. When a high-end fashion brand sells a basic leather handbag for $10,000 today, or when a tech company uses proprietary hardware locks to prevent third-party repairs, they are using the exact same playbook as the medieval pigment cartels. They are selling exclusivity, social status, and controlled access. The medieval pigment merchants did not just trade color. They proved that human beings will pay almost any price to distinguish themselves from their neighbors, to signal power, and to capture a tiny piece of beauty in a dark, restrictive world. The vault of colors was never really about paint, plants, or crushed bugs. You were never buying pigment. You were buying a seat at the table of visual dominance. And in a world designed to keep the masses in the dark, those who controlled the light held the power of kings.